So welcome again to the Cedar Rapids Community School District Facility Master Plan Task Force Update. This is an informational session about where we currently are as a task force and what's in front of us in the spring to come, and giving an overview of what we've been able to do so far, and then also what are the tasks ahead of us. Thank you for taking time to be here tonight. And for those who've just joined the session, we are recording tonight's session so that we can share it with our community who are not able to be here this evening. I am at this point in time going to put in our chat the link to a Google form, which is really a means of gaining feedback from you at the end of tonight's conversation, or even if you have questions or thoughts throughout the process, you're welcome to fill out that form at any time, and would also welcome questions or feedback in the chat as we move through tonight's content. Heather, give a wave. Heather, thank you so much for organizing us this evening and organizing the Zoom registrations. Also, Heather will be recording our chat and the questions so that we have a documented catalog of the types of questions that are being surfaced, as well as developing an FAQ so that we can see what the frequently asked questions are and then the responses to those questions as we move forward in this work. So without any further ado, I am going to share my screen, and then I am going to do just some verbal introductions of some steering committee members who are also with us this evening, who are helping lift this very heavy work. So sharing the screen now. And if I could get just some verbal, nonverbal cues as a thumbs up, if you can see that slide deck. Seeing some thumbs up, thank you very much for letting me know that you can see what we'll be sharing tonight. Heather and steering committee members, if at any point in time you see an opportunity to answer a question that I'm perhaps not capturing in the chat, please just unmic yourself and say, hey, Noreen, I got one we can Q&A right now, and that'd be great. Thank you so much. So again, my name is Noreen Bush, Superintendent of Schools here, and so delighted that you've joined us this evening for this update. So this is the quick agenda. So again, welcome, and I want to introduce our steering committee members who are helping this Facility Master Plan Task Force work. We have 3 of our administrators participating in this work. Myself, Dave Nicholson, who's on the screen. Dave, if you want to give a quick wave. Dave is our Chief Financial Officer, Executive Director of Business Services. John Galbraith, who is our Buildings and Grounds Manager. John, if you're there, you can give a quick wave. Or he is the purple J on the screen. Thank you, John, for being here tonight. And then we have Heather, if you want to give a wave. And Heather has supported a lot of the behind the scenes work. And Tracy, who I don't think is able to be with us here tonight, is just they're the ones who are helping getting communications out to all of you and inviting you to these conversations. In addition to that, we knew as we were moving this work forward this year that we'd had a plan in place for our elementary work. We were going to need to really assess our secondary buildings. We'll talk more about that content in a minute, but we invited an opportunity for some experts to assess our facilities, the structures of our facilities, and the educational environments of our facilities. And we put out an RFP in I guess it was late fall or early fall, and we had we were looking for some hand raisers who were willing to take on that contract to assess our buildings. And we're very grateful that we had a hand raised, and it was the only hand raised. Architects from OPN who have agreed to assess our buildings and have been doing that work. And so tonight we have some of our OPN members, Joe and Vicky. I know you're here tonight if you want to give a wave. So they also can be helpful to answer questions tonight as they've been doing some assessments, especially of our secondary buildings. So thank you, steering committee members, and just a huge shout out to our task force members who've been putting in a lot of heavy hours and have a lot of hours ahead of them in leading this work. So thank you, task force members who are also here this evening. We're going to do a high-level overview of our strategic plan and where the facility master plan fits in our strategic work. We're going to review the facility master plan history and timeline starting from 2016 to present, and then the current work of the task force, what's been underway and what have we been working on, and then also the timeline of what the work has been from November to present, and then from today moving forward into the spring, what will the work be? And then we're really seeking your feedback, and then we'll also talk about next steps of what our process will be moving forward. So tonight you're not going to hear about really any decisions because no decisions have been made yet. You're really going to get an update about the current state and some of the information we've been able to digest so far as a task force, and then what we anticipate our next steps to be. So this is just a quick view of what our plan on a page looks like. On our website, we have a much deeper dive into this strategic plan. But as you can see, our strategic plan is anchored in our vision. And right down here, you can see that vision is every learner future ready. And so what does that mean as a system? And we really unpacked that a lot. We focus a lot on access for all of our kids and our families, all of our schools, all of our staff members, and we're also focused on equity. And by equity, we mean, does everybody get what they need in order to be future ready? So that also has implications when you consider facilities. Do all of our kids within every facility have what they need? And does every facility have what it needs to be future ready? So when we look at what that means in the context of our strategic plan, we organize our strategies as a district into 4 major focus areas. So you can go all the way over here and look at systems and resources. Our facility master plan is certainly one of our strategies, and that facility master plan has some timelines and expectations to it, which is what we are working on with the task force right now, is to do the next version of the work ahead. So we'll talk more about that timeline next, and where we've been and where we are and where we're headed. So here we go, a little bit of history. 2016, there was a new vision to consider where we wanted to go as a school district, certainly around education and prioritizing opportunities for our students. That also included what was our current state of all of our facilities, what are the needs of our facilities, and then what is our current inventory, and then what were the projections of the future. So because that question was out there, a task force was created, and that was a very large group of people. Many of you were on that task force that are here tonight. And so I would say it was 80 plus community members who participated in that work. And that work was launched in 2016, but it continued in another year and even into the following year. And then through that task force work, a plan was created. And in January of 2018, a plan was adopted by our school board, and the task force zoomed in their work over a 2-year time period, focused on our elementary schools as an initial focus. So the thought process was looking at the distribution of where our schools are, what the enrollment is of the schools, what are our neighborhoods within the schools, but also where are the opportunities and future forward opportunities for students with best practices within what a school actually looks like. So that means collaboration opportunities, creativity opportunities, inviting community engagement and partnerships within a school, and then even environmentally, having light enter our buildings, and accessibility for all kids to be able to get in and out of the building and having access to all parts of the building. So really thinking about our facilities from a different point of view than when many of them were originally built. So that was the work. And again, the elementary focus was to think about going from 21 elementaries to a number more like 13 over a 20-year time period. And we'll talk about what that timeline looks like now. The future forward work was, of course, considering where to go first. Started with the West Side projects, and that was one, due to some projected enrollment increase on the West Side, also the condition of the buildings on the West Side, and what might be some first opportunities. And the first recommendations were the Coolidge site and Jackson site, and then repurposing Truman, who's situated in between the two of those. So that was the initial launch of this strategic facility master plan and focusing in on the elementaries. So what was the process to get the work started? Research was done by a team looking at what the best practices are, what are the opportunities, what do we want our buildings to look like, sound like, feel like for our kids in Cedar Rapids. And so that work was done there in 2019. And at the same time, just a huge shout out to our school board members. Thank you, thank you, thank you, school board members, to always be thinking about not just the current state, but also what's the future of our school district, and how are we not only serving our children and our families, also our community. So the school board, when adopting this plan in 2018, also had the foresight to say, you know what, when you finish this first part of these projects, better put a pause on the plan to assess, reflect what's working, what's not working, what's the current data say, before we make a next step plan on that elementary scope. Additionally, what hasn't been under the umbrella of the FMP in 2018 was secondary buildings. So also knowing that as the facility master plan work moved forward, knew there would have to be another draft considering secondary schools. So as we move forward into the implementation, we're able to break ground at Coolidge in that spring of 2020. Well, if you recall, there was something else that broke the world in 2020 in March, and that was the pandemic that hit us all. And so the question is, how might that have interrupted this process? We were able to move forward on our work with Coolidge, breaking ground at Coolidge, which has become the West Willow building, and despite the pandemic. So other things that we had to consider is enrollment, staffing, boundary work. So last year was a pretty heavy year for the continued implementation of the facility master plan on the West Side, but you'll see what's at the top of the school year. We had a system interruption and a community disruption with the derecho, which impacted not only parts of the new build at West Willow, which needed attention, that was very repairable, but also all of our buildings were impacted by the derecho. And so we had additional opportunity there to assess the current state of our buildings, but it was an incredible fall to be able, we had to repair all those buildings. So there was some interruption with the implementation of our plan because of that. And then also as the pandemic continued, many of you have experienced this, there has also been interruptions with manufacturing and development and getting access to resources. So that has delayed some of our work a little bit, but not enough, because in 2021, we were able to open West Willow. Huge thank you to our construction teams, to our buildings and grounds department, to our architects, to engineers, to the city of Cedar Rapids. So many folks that were able to make this happen. Huge gratitude for our community. And then concurrently, we moved the other parts of the plan forward by breaking ground at Jackson. The future of Maple Grove will be there. And then also what was a surprise to us is this fall, we were able to consider what the needs for Truman would be in its repurposing. It was quite clear to us we had an increased need around preschool and early learning. So didn't know that 2 years ago, but now we know that Truman will be repurposed as an early learning center. So there's lots of things that have been going underway since 2016, but that gives you just a little bit of an idea of where we are with the initial implementation of that facility master plan. But then also right now, this pause on the plan is underway with the facility master plan task force. So as you look over here, we have a lot of work that the task force is getting after, and that is analyzing data, which includes our current state of enrollment and our population, understanding budget allocations and our school facilities, also a deep assessment process of our secondary facilities, and then understanding what might be some next step recommendation plans for the elementary, and what might we create for our secondary buildings, and include that in a next draft of the facility master plan. So just going to advance the screen here. So this is just another way to think about this. We had draft 1 of our FMP, which was adopted in 2018. And just picture this 3-tier blocks as a timeline of 20 some years. In the first chunk, 2 projects to start was, and these are building site projects, a new building at the Coolidge, former Coolidge site, and a new building at the Jackson site. And then we know that that also impacted Truman, but Truman was not a new location for a new building. Rather, it was being repurposed. So the names that were articulated on this original draft were the potential building site locations. So the notice the dot on the line here, that was the board's vision of having a pause on the plan when we did this first phase of projects that impacted 3 of our schools, 2 new builds. Then what might be the potential next step? When the original draft was created, based on the data, they created what were tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 projects based on the data that was relevant in 2018. Enrollment, facilities conditions, projections of population studies, and even neighborhood designs, and what would be best for our community and our school district. So what we don't know is if the next step is actually, you could see Arthur was projected. Is that the next destination or not? That is what the current task force is working on. Lots of data to analyze, but determining a next step. So that was the 2018 draft of what these tiers could look like over a 20-year time period. So that's what we call it, a draft. It was first shot at this. What does this look like? The concept hasn't changed, but what the next step details, we want to make sure we're being careful in assessing the current state of our district. So the pause is on the plan. We're assessing and designing right now. So then the next step is draft 2 will be developed, which will include not only the next steps of our elementary, but also what's the plan and proposal for our secondary schools, which might be just immediate needs out of the gate or long-term needs that we also see as a 15 to 20-year plan. So might go either way. We're still in the midst of gathering, assessing the data. So those are the 2 clear focus areas. Determine our elementary next steps. That plan's already been adopted. We just need to determine what's the best next step. And then 2, developing a plan to address our secondary school needs. So here we are, not going to spend a lot of time in this. It's very complex, but you might want to know how is Cedar Rapids paying for the facility master plan? So these buckets just represent the different kinds of budgets that school finance has to live in. And each one of these buckets comes with its own set of rules. So it's very different from your personal accounting systems at home, or even maybe for your business. But I'll just use the first bucket as an example. This is our biggest bucket, and it's the general fund. And you can see the revenue sources that contribute to this general fund. And the general fund can pay for things like this: salaries, benefits, services that we need, curriculum, equipment. but the biggest expenditure out of the general fund bucket is our most precious resource, and that is our people who serve our children every day. So our staff is the biggest part of that bucket. Like 90% of that bucket is, staffing and general fund. And I'm going to fast forward to another bucket on this page, the Pebble Fund, which comes from property taxes. Notice what's not in this box is salaries and benefits. We can't use a Pebble Fund to pay for people, but we can use it for improvement of our grounds and our buildings and equipment. And so that is a type of example of a bucket that we can use that can go towards facilities. But the bucket isn't big enough to pay for an entire new high school, for example. That Pebble bucket's not that big. So this bucket's usually used for things that we need to keep up with. It also can purchase vehicles, and many times that's very helpful for our transportation department. It also can pay for some things within the technology realm. But let's get to facilities and what we're using, what buckets are paying for our current facility master plan with elementary, and then what would we project for our secondary schools. So this is some additional buckets. So when the district adopted the facility master plan, adopted in 2018, focused on elementary schools, the projection of the funding stream was actually coming from a bucket we call save dollars, which is cash flow from sales tax revenue. And so what we have to make sure that we do is bring an approval process, and that's a public hearing that we have at a board meeting. And that actually also needs to be part of a community understanding of what that means in a vote in order to approve the future work of how to pay for facilities and things that are needed to keep up with a school district. And so that bucket was allocated as the way and the means in which we could pay for our elementary school projects, whether they be new builds or renovations. That's why it's a 20-year plan to kind of chip away at what's the need now, what's the need now. We're not going to do 10 projects at the elementary all at one time because that bucket's not big enough to do that. And also that would be a challenge to be able to accomplish that. So that is the projection of how we will continue to pay for our elementary facility master plan. So then it comes to secondary. What would we do to potentially pay for secondary? Well, they're bigger facilities, and its inventory also needs attention, as we did the assessment process with elementaries. So what we imagine what would happen is we'd have to list some priorities, be really clear about what we're going to be asking for, with the clear focus on every learner future ready. And it's not just while we're serving our students, number one priority, and our families, but also our community and the development of Cedar Rapids and what's the big picture and what we're trying to do with our community for our kids and our families. And so that we imagine when we get to the end of this spring would be a projection of a dollar amount that would potentially be a request to the community around a general obligation bond or a GO bond. You may have seen in the news recently of other districts that have a GO bond coming up in the date of March, that it's going to go to the vote for their community in March. So that is one potential date in which schools can choose to advocate for this in their community. However, there's a whole process behind that. So you can't just pick any date. You have to pick the selected calendar dates for GO bonds. So right now that's in the first week of March. The next opportunity has to be 6 months later. So for Iowa, that would be in September. Potentially that's what we're earmarking for wherever we land this spring with a recommendation. That would be what our ask might be to the community, if that's where the task force lands, and if that is what the community supports and what our board would endorse, going for that in September. So you can see if we were to do a general obligation bond to our community, the cost of a $55 million bond would be a cost on a property tax, 50 cents on the dollar. And so this is potentially option 1, option 2, option 3, what that might cost a taxpayer if we were to ask for a GO bond for facility improvement for secondary schools. This is, sorry for the fuzziness on this graphic, but just a high level overview of our certified enrollment in Cedar Rapids from 1997 to last year's enrollment. In 1997, we had 17,600 some students. And then as of last year, it was 16,200 students. You can see how this kind of ebbs and flows. And then you can also see the significance of what happened in our history in regards to 2008 when the flood hit, but also when the derecho hit and the pandemic. So it will be interesting to watch this trend over time and the stabilization. But if you were to look at the state of Iowa, there has been an overall loss of population as well as student enrollment. And so for us as a community, we just want to lean in and look at then what do we need to best serve our kids right now. And also for projections, what we can see with some data is that there's some projected stabilization, especially with the anticipated birth rate, and then also what's happening within our residential development. So this is just a historical capture over time. And then this is just another data point, and I'll bring its relevancy when it comes to serving facilities. But we have had an increase of a demographic. Actually, in 2008, we had 1.37% of students who qualify for English language learning services. So many times that means students are immigrants or refugees or coming from somewhere where English is not their first language. And now we have better than 7% of our students qualify for those services. So back in 2008, when we think about facility planning, we would not have had the services for all English language learning students in every single building. But the buildings that did have that service need space and dedicated opportunity within an environment to provide that specialized instruction and support. Fast forward to the current state, we've had to create spaces in many of our buildings to serve those students who would need those services across almost all of our settings. And we see that, that this trend line is probably going to continue to increase. So that when you're considering building a building, how do you design for spaces that specialize for certain programs? And then also this is just a demographic too, just to show you kind of the nature of our community. And that is in 2001, the free and reduced lunch population for Cedar Rapids was at about 26%. And now we're at about 57% of our kids who qualify for free and reduced lunch. But you can see it sometimes it trends down a little bit back up. But I would say that, so what this means is that how are we planning for access for every family, every child, that no matter where you are in our community, you're getting equal access from a facilities point of view, from an educational point of view. And of course, we're working really hard to make all that happen. And so what are the opportunities that we could create from a facility master plan lens to support all of our kids? And then I could go on and on about athletics and activities too, and the hopes there. We'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into our additional data. So just what has the task force done so far? So up to this point in time, we have had 6 meetings, and really it's been like a fire hose of data. We've done some building tours in our secondary facilities, but we've also looked at enrollment data. We have looked at some facility data. We have looked at our population study data. We've looked at demographic data. just a lot of information. And then OPN has been presenting building assessment data. So when we look at our facilities, what are the actual needs in our secondary facilities? They're also doing listening sessions with our staff members, and that's some qualitative data. So as this information's coming in, the task force has had a lot to absorb. And so their next meeting, which is next week, we are going to hyper focus on our elementary data that we've had so far. And then we're looking at some supposals. And by a supposal is, so what might you suppose would be the best next step based on all the information we have so far to move forward on the adopted plan that was adopted in 2018. And so that's that initial next step. And then in February through the spring, we will continue to unpack our secondary data. And so I'm going to dig into these points just a little deeper around what we've looked at with some things with elementary and with secondary. But ultimately, the goal is to have data, people grappling with that data, having discussions around that data, asking really hard questions, getting input like this very opportunity tonight, and then bringing a recommendation to the board so that we can do some amazing things for our kids. So here's the elementary focus work so far. This was the original 2018 drafted recommendation. And so the committee's big idea was to go from 21 schools to 13. 10 of those elementary new builds would be just newly constructed buildings like West Willow. 3 of those would be renovation projects. And then the rest of the schools would somehow be repurposed or phased out. So let's just use the initial tier 1, phase 1. Coolidge, new build. Jackson, new build. Now become West Willow and Maple Grove. Coolidge opened this fall. Jackson will open next fall. And then Truman has been repurposed. So they are no longer, it's an elementary school. It is going to be an early learning center. And we'll continue to assess what the needs are as we move forward. So what we also don't necessarily know is that what the next step will be on the plan in regards to, is it a new build or is it a renovation project? And are there other projects that might be renovations that we thought at once upon a time would be new constructions? So all of these questions are coming to play with the Facility Master Plan Task Force. This is just another way to look at these tiers of these buildings. So you can see here again, it's Coolidge, Jackson, and Arthur. But this explains what created the tier 1 and the tier 2 and the tier 3. And really it was the condition of the facilities, the needs of the population and the enrollment, and what is the best opportunity based on those projections moving forward. So that's the 2018 projection of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. We believe that those tiers will have some synonymous assessment, but some things will change. And so what might make that change? And here's an example, our elementary enrollment. So this is the, our current school environments, and then what the enrollment trends have been from the 2001-2 school year to 21-22 school year. And so we'll just use, our current largest building, and it's also at the end of the line here, Viola Gibson. And you can see when Viola Gibson opened, my goodness, 2002-3, almost 20 years ago, population was 460. And then you can see what the trend has been over time. Some of the ebbs and flows is due to programming. So maybe AK was in their building, alternative kindergarten one year, and then maybe the next year it wasn't. So some of that can create some of this ebb and flow in regards to programming. But over time, Viola has trended upwards here to now 521 head count. And so we then ask ourselves, is there other continued growth that might happen in that side of town? Might there be different needs for Viola that we didn't anticipate in 2018 that might be now in the next 5 to 10 years that we have to look at that tiered system and what's appropriate for Viola? So although it's our newest building just ahead of West Willow, it's still almost 20 years old now. So that's just an example of one population study that we would have to consider. And then also you can look at some of our smaller buildings, like whether it be Madison or Grant, what's that population study? And what does that data trend look like? And does that too impact our decisions? So Grant, and then if you look at Madison, its trend is 273 and 012, and then now is 165. But we also know that's impacted by pandemic and derecho. So then what are some of these questions that we're asking about which direction might we go considering this current data? And then this is just another way to see that enrollment data, just with bar graphs. You can see where we've got some ups, we got some plateaus, we have some dips, we have some ups and downs. And so when we're saying what could we anticipate that might steady the ship for access and equity as an entire system, and support our neighborhoods and our buildings from a facility point of view. And this is just one more way to look at our enrollment, and that's just with our map. So what's the boundary for each one of our elementary schools, and what's their current enrollment? And then when you look at proximity, what makes sense when we're looking at our enrollment and the projection of growth and what might happen within our community. And then where is it we may not have projection of growth, but it's pretty steady, but there might be opportunity to look at 2 schools together or 3 schools and how they might work together. So that is the data that we are considering in order to make next step recommendations. So the next steps for elementary, we're processing all this data. We're creating some proposals based on that data. That's our February 15th meeting. And we're like, this is heavy lifts about what might be these next steps. And we've been deep in this data since November. And then ultimately, of course, is to develop a recommendation for our next project for the next 3 to 4 years. And so is that 1 project? Is it 2 projects? What makes the most sense? And therefore, that would be the recommendation would bring to the board this spring. So we also know that we want to keep this conversation constant and moving forward. So it's a living, breathing document, that facility master plan. So in the fall of 2022, that task force will continue work around elementary and project maybe a 4 to 10 year projected plan, also implementing where are those pauses on that plan and what might we anticipate in the next 4 to 10 years. So what's the immediate step and what might be the next step after that, so we can make sure that we're anticipating those next steps. So quick transition, and I would say, is there any questions in the chat around elementary steering committee members? Do you see anything that might be helpful to respond to at this point in time? We're going to keep rolling then. Secondary focus. This has really been heavy lifting from the work with OPN as our consultants to assess our secondary buildings. This is heavy, heavy work. We have 10 secondary buildings. 1 building is heavy work to assess, but 10, that's a lot. And again, just a reminder, we are the 2nd largest district in the state of Iowa. So this is a lot of work. So of course, we've had a project kickoff and task force is underway, but really we are right in here and just starting to come over into this lane, but we are in the research and assessment process. So as the spring continues, we'll need more opportunities to engage you all in the things that we're finding and potential recommendations or decisions we have to make. And then conceptualizing will come when we've reached some decisions and have a next step plan of this is going to be our recommendation. And so that's certainly the fun part. Might be more over on the other side of the timeline. This is fun, but it is heavy work right now in that research and assess stage. So this was an initial projected timeline of secondary and elementary and how we were work everything out. And we thought maybe we would be able to have an earlier timeline for a recommendation around our elementaries. There was just too much data that we had to get after in order to make the best recommendations. So it slowed down a little bit, but we're confident here early this spring we'll be able to get out of the elementary, an elementary recommendation while we're continuing to work on that secondary work. But you'll see the star here. September, the hope would be that we've got a really good next step, and it might be just a small step, but if it's a large step, that will look different too. But what might be the recommendation that we bring to the board and that the board has confidence in, or our community has confidence in, that then we bring to a vote in September for a potential GO bond to improve secondary facilities. So the secondary school process, lots of people involved in this process, both qualitative and quantitative ways. We're getting this data. So the OPN continues to have listening sessions with staff and educational assessment opportunities. The task force has been way underway and looking at information, but I'm just going to zoom right down here that we've been really hyper focused on some facility assessment information. And I'm going to share some information tonight focused on one facility as an example, but that is kind of the midst of where we are right now. A lot of this information is being gathered and the task force will be getting that data in the upcoming meetings. So there's just been a lot of behind the scenes process work to gather the data to assess our secondary facilities. So far in the secondary world, there have been listening sessions, there have been educational assessments, there's been building tours, and then of course this facility assessment. And that means looking at the actual facility itself and what does it need to meet standards and to be up to code and to be accessible. And what would we need to best serve our kids in our secondary facilities. So we're going to zoom in on this right now, this part, the facility assessment piece. So here we go. There's a layout of our district, just kind of a hyper level map here. And you can see where our secondary buildings are. The only building that does not have a boundary to it is Metro High School. All of our high school students are welcome at Metro. That your address does not indicate whether you can or cannot go to Metro. All Cedar Rapids kids can attend Metro High School. But we do have boundaries, of course, for Kennedy, Jefferson, and Wash as our high schools. And then, of course, each one of our middle schools has different feeder patterns to go to those high schools. So you can see the layout of our district, and you all are familiar, of course, with the layout of our district. So this is just what we've been able to accomplish around the assessment data so far with facilities assessments is we've gone into the middle school data, and it's a really heavy amount of data. So I'm going to use one example tonight just to give you an idea of the types of things that the task force is rolling up their sleeves and analyzing. So we're going to just look at Franklin Middle School as an example. This is the aerial view of Franklin. And so you can see the great tennis courts here and the building itself and the parking to the side and the green space. So this is what the district owns when we talk about Franklin as a site. And then this is just one example externally of what would we consider some deficiencies on the site that might need to be addressed from a facility point of view. And I'm just going to fast forward to the last one, which is ADA compliance. And so we, of course, want to have compliance in regards to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And that is that we have, for example, wheelchair accessibility from multiple points of view to any of our facilities. And so that is one component that's really important when we're considering, when I talk about access and equity, is ADA compliance. And what do we need to do to improve our facilities to improve ADA compliance? One tiny thread, which is a big thread, that is a part of the consideration of these assessments. So there was a lot of data beyond this that the task force was able to look at. OPN was able to do floor plans and heat maps of this area would need a lot of attention. That might be a red zone. Green zones mean we've got some good things happening in the building that don't necessarily need to be addressed. Yellow zone might be, you might not have to address it right now, but you're going to need to address it pretty soon. And so when we talk about getting things up to code, it's if we built a new building today, these would be the code standards. So we're not out of compliance in these secondary buildings, it's just the buildings were built in an era that had different code requirements than we do in 2022. So we have addressed a lot of things in our buildings. Our buildings and grounds team have kept up with a lot of so many things to keep our buildings in good shape. However, we have needs that haven't been addressed. So the red zones would be things that we would say it's got about a 0 to 5 year timeline here in which it's going to have to be addressed. So this is just an example of that assessment process and a summary of these particular areas that are going to need to be addressed or they're doing okay. Here's the electrical component. Again, a summary of just an example of things that would need to be addressed and things that are doing okay. But there is a lot more, of course, when you think about windows and staircases and many different things that go into a building. When you think about Franklin, I mean, that's 100 years old. And so that is a building that also has historical components that if you want to do upgrades, you also have to be sensitive to honoring that lens of it. So it's sometimes more expensive in the context of Franklin than maybe it would be at Viola Gibson, for example. So when Franklin got completed and its assessment to bring things up to code, about $35 million for Franklin, and you can see the breakdown of that dollar amount. So that's just one example of one building. We'll go into the high school data here meeting after next, and that will be, again, a great opportunity for more data information. But we did this for all of the middle schools. I shouldn't say we. Our assessment team from OPN did this information, but brought it to the task force. So we look at all of our middle schools, Taft and Harding are sister buildings. Their upgrades are kind of similar. And so therefore their upgrade price tag is very similar. And then our buildings that are older, like Franklin, McKinley, Roosevelt, and Wilson, beautiful, they have a different price tag to bring up to code. And so you can see the range of those dollar amounts of the current assessment for those buildings. And so that subtotal just for middle schools would be about $150 million and change, $150 million, 700,000 to get those buildings to code. What that does not include is outdoor athletic facilities. It does not include kind of some fun bells and whistles, whether it be a rec center or a fine arts center. This is just to do to bring things to what we would believe is necessary to, if these were to be new buildings, these would be the expectations. And so we're not out of compliance, but there's definitely going to be needs in the near future for all of these buildings. So next steps for secondary. Next on the, as I mentioned, we're going to be reviewing the high school facility assessments, just like I discussed the middle school assessments. We're going to process that data, a lot of conversation and digging in and understanding what it is that we're looking at for our entire district. And then review additional data points from our listening sessions and educational assessments. And then a survey input that the team will have an opportunity to give us their feedback, and then community input with additional community sessions, and then develop a recommendation for late spring for the board to consider. So that's a lot of information. And I know that is a lot of Noreen talking, but definitely gives you an idea, at least of the current state of our facility master plan task force work. And then also what we're anticipating in the weeks and months ahead of us as we move into June. So without any further conversation from me, would welcome questions and feedback in the chat. And then also, just as a reminder, I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point in time. Want to make sure that folks have an opportunity if you came in late, that we welcome your feedback via Google survey as well. If you'd like to ask us questions, or what are your ideas, some pretty open-ended questions. We really just want to hear from you.
Noreen, I saw that there was one question about controls in there, and I can have either Joe or John offer feedback for that too, but I think there are so many sheets and sheets and sheets of this data. I think that was just a miscolor on that specific item. There are so many items, and we're still going back through and combing through, just like a typo when you type a J instead of a G. This was just colored. So the text is correct. It's just the color that was wrong. Is that right, Joe or John?
That's correct. It should be red.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you for asking the question, Cindy. Other questions? So great question about OPN and their role in this work. So as we move forward in the projects, OPN was the architect selected for the West Willow and Maple Grove builds. However, this assessment contract was a separate RFP process. They happened to be the only architect firm that put a bid in and were willing to do the work. And we knew that we had to move the work forward, and we really appreciated their lens and willingness and expertise to do it. However, as the work moves forward on any next steps on the elementary plan or future builds with secondary, we have to do that process all over again for architect bids, and that there's no assumption that OPN would be those architects selected. To that point, next Tuesday, when we have our hyper focus on elementary and what our next step plans will be, OPN has been our assessment process for our secondary buildings. So they've been at all of our meetings because secondary has been a part of all of our meetings. The next meeting, they're not going to be participating in that meeting because it's elementary only conversation. And we just don't want to be biased or put them in a situation either. So we are just, thank you, GoPN, for being gracious and understanding. They won't be participating in that particular meeting where we're digging in deep around elementary and next step plans. So that's an excellent question. So I hope that answers the question about their role. So 2 separate contracts, 2 separate roles. Initial contracts with the initial elementary builds, separate contract for this assessment process, and they were the only bidders within that process. When we do the next step, we're going to start all over again. And so who will be the selection there? It'll depend on the project and who's the best fit. Other questions from the team? Those excellent questions. Well, it is 6:55. I once had a mentor tell me, Noreen, it's never a bad idea to end a meeting early if you've completed all your objectives. So I think we have, at this point in time, completed all of our objectives. If there's no further questions, we do welcome your feedback. Please use the Google form. We will be sending out a recording of this meeting and a Google form. So and we'll include that in our newsletter this Friday. So if you have a colleague or a friend or a neighbor or a family member who could not be here this evening and you think they really would love this information, know that both sessions are recorded, similar information, but different sets of questions, and would welcome that opportunity for them to watch and give us feedback as we move forward with this process. As the superintendent of the greatest school district on the planet, and I would say, yes, KCRG, please use that as a quote. Cedar Rapids Community School District is the greatest school district on the planet. I am so proud of our community, and I'm so proud of this work and the task force and our families and partners saying, let's think about possibilities together and what it means to serve our children together, our families, and the great city of Cedar Rapids. So what can we do about possibilities? Because the decisions we make here are not just for the next 5 years. This is a projection of 50 to 100 years. And what great opportunity we have. So thank you, everyone, for being here tonight, and really appreciate your feedback. You have a good night. And 6:57, we've ended a little early. I'll stop the recording now. Thank you.